Tonight's talk presents the results, as Professor Alston has indicated, of the 2-year Leverhume Trust project entitled Beakers and Bodies, which was undertaken at the University of Birmingham, of Aberdeen even, oh dear, between 2007 and 2009. These are the findings of a team that was led by Neil Curtis and the late Ian Shepherd. The project focused on the Beaker burials and associated communities and culture of the northeast of Scotland, dating to the Chalcolithic in the early Bronze Age, in other words between the 25th century and around the 20th century BC. In terms of aims and achievements, the project has generated around 35 new C14 dates, including 19 on Beaker burials, to complement an already substantial number of radiocarbon dates for the Grampian region in this period. We can now say that around 50% of the Beaker burials ever discovered in Aberdeenshire are associated with a high-quality radiocarbon date, and this is really unheard of, and it makes Aberdeenshire in the northeast one of the best dated areas for Beakers and early Bronze Age studies in Britain, if not parts of Europe. The project also undertook stable isotope analysis to reveal the diet of these individuals, and that was undertaken by Mandy Jay of Sheffield and the Beaker Isotope Project. We also reanalysed and examined Beaker skeletons from across eastern Scotland in order to update information for things like age and sex and pathology to the modern standards that we demand. And that was undertaken by Dr. Meg Hutchison. We also established a data set, an extensive data set of all the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age burials, single burials, that have been found in Aberdeenshire, with which to contextualise these results. And finally, we constructed an updated typology for the Beakers of North East Scotland that relates things like form and decoration of the pots themselves to other aspects, other relevant aspects of the funerary practice. Before considering the implications of these findings, it's worth just adding some background to the Beaker burial phenomenon. In Grampian, Beaker burials were concentrated in significant numbers around the key river valleys, that is, of the Don, the Dee and the Devron, and the coastal plains. There are around 110 recorded Beaker burials in stone-lined short kists from north-east Scotland, with around 80% of those discovered prior to the 1970s. This is a considerable number given the absence of an especially early antiquarian tradition. The reporting and recording of these graves therefore benefited first from the University of Aberdeen's professors of anatomy during the early 20th century, the likes of Robert Reid and Alexander Lowe, and then subsequently from the work of Ian and Lecky Shepherd and Moira Gregg at the Aberdeenshire Council over the last 30 years. The Beaker phenomenon is of course known throughout Europe during the second half of the 3rd millennium BC, from Italy, Spain, even northern Africa. Although the Scottish evidence is the most northerly of this distribution, the density of Beaker burials in eastern Scotland, primarily Aberdeenshire, is significant by any standards. So, the placement of the dead, accompanied by Beaker pots, marks an important change in the burial practices and in technology. It's a period during which individuals were buried as individuals, rather than in communal tombs. However, to what extent this reflects social status and individualism in the modern sense, and to what extent this is a significant proportion of the population at the time, are points that we must consider in the course of this talk. Beakers are also associated with the first metalworking in Britain, with gold and copper, as well as with the earliest bronze metalworking some centuries later. Indeed, North East Scotland emerged as a powerhouse in the production of early Bronze Age artefacts, such as the flat axes after the 22nd century BC. And really, what these changes and developments in technology and burial mean in social terms, particularly regarding mobility, status and social organisation, as well as beliefs and identity, are the most interesting challenges of studying the Beaker phenomenon, and Eastern Scotland now provides one of the best opportunities for getting to grips with these questions. The results of the project then can help to address some of these key themes. And in order to do that, I'd firstly like to consider what the body from the Beaker burial tells us. It's true that funerary practices are of course not a direct reflection of everyday life, but increasingly stable isotope analysis is giving us access through the skeletal remains to everyday realities concerning both mobility and diet. Our colleague, Dr. Mandy Jay, has identified the diet of some 40 early Bronze Age individuals from northeast Scotland, based on the ratio of carbon and nitrogen in the collagen of their bones. These levels were built up from broad categories of food consumed during their lifetimes. The results show a primarily terrestrial, that is, a land-based food sources, and that these individuals did not consume significant quantities of marine resources, despite the proximity of a number of these burials to the sea. Study of microwear on the teeth of Beaker individuals by Patrick Mahoney suggests that the diet was rich in plant foods, and this is really the diet that we might expect from committed farmers. The results are consistent then across time and grave good traditions, Beakers and food vessels and unassociated graves of the early Bronze Age, suggesting the basic diet of these communities was broadly consistent across Scotland from the 24th to the 20th centuries BC. However, like all techniques, there are limitations, and we're really only seeing the majority of these individuals' diets. What we're lacking is perhaps the more subtle elements, the special Christmas-type turkey dishes that we're not picking up. So I think we have to view this with a dose of reserve. These results provide welcome empirical evidence, however, for a farming lifestyle, the kind that prehistorians have long suspected and assumed. Moreover, the significance will become clearer when and as they are contextualised with reference to the much-needed domestic and environmental evidence from this period. However, it's important to recall that Beaker burials are only a selected sample of the population that existed at this point in time. A speculative question then for future discoveries and sampling is whether there existed non-Beaker groups who undertook fishing but did not bury their dead in the same way. In other words, was there an earlier origin to the long-standing tradition in Aberdeenshire of a farm and fisherfolk rivalry? And just to put a word in for the role of mobility, stable isotopes in tracking mobility, in the coming year or two, Mike Parker-Pearson's isotope project will reach publication, and it really stands to further revolutionise our knowledge of mobility and beyond, mobility in the UK and beyond. And initial snippets of information suggest there is indeed a lot of moving around of Britain during this period, and that will be an excellent strand to add to this dietary information. Assessments of age and sex of skeletal remains are notoriously problematic insofar as they may differ between specialists, and also there's constantly changing and updating techniques for how we age and sex. And we're therefore very fortunate that our colleague at the Marshall Museum, Meg Hutchison, undertook a major survey of age and sex of all the Eastern Scottish short-kissed burials that Alison Sheridan was able to provide her with. And this produces a reliable and useful insight into the age and sex population that was granted and honoured by burial at this time. In general, among the Beaker burials of Eastern Scotland, there's an apparent bias towards adult males in the middle years of their lives. Indeed, there are 3 times as many males as females. Children and sub-adults, and perhaps young adults, are underrepresented in comparison with the adults in the age bracket of over 25 years. Similar patterns are evident elsewhere in Britain. A recent sample studied by Patrick Mahoney for the Beaker Isotope Project showed twice as many males as females within their sample of Beaker burials from across the British Isles. And we can compare some of these gender imbalances with other traditions. It's interesting to see that excavations at enclosed and non-Beaker cemeteries, as well as food vessel graves, provided a quite different age and sex structure, with more or less equal numbers of males and females in some cases, and a considerable number of under-18s involved, for instance, in these collective cemetery barrows or cairns. And these provide some similar demographics to the kind of, perhaps the kind of population that we'd expect from a pre or post-improvement agricultural community in areas like North East Scotland. And indeed, in the case of food vessels, These appear to show that females rather than males are more commonly represented in areas such as Angus, and that's very interesting. It's unfortunate that the sample size is not as large as we might wish. Nonetheless, the differences do coincide with important changes and differences in funerary practice after the 22nd century BC in areas to the south of Aberdeenshire, and we'll return to the significance of these differences and changes later on. The bodies themselves were almost invariably contained within short kists of average dimensions of around 4 feet by 2.5 feet, reinforcing the prescribed requirement for a crouched body posture. Formal floorings of paving or water-worn pebbles occur in around a quarter of Aberdeenshire's Beaker short kists. A small number of kists were lined with clay, a clay luting. It's around 7%. And these numbers, however, may be artificially low. Many were discovered before the modern era of excavation. However, a neat flooring, water tightness, together with a beaker pot, and evidence for deposits of charcoal and in situ burning, which occur in a number of kists, for instance, underneath the paving stones of Borrowstone 6, and then again burning on the capstone, perhaps evoked the safety and comforts of home and hearth. But they also tell us something about attitudes to the body, and this is further demonstrated when we come to look at landscape setting. Data analysed by Aberdeenshire Council, in particular by Bruce Mann, tells us about the typical setting of Beaker burial. They're almost always located on well-drained soils such as gravels, on slopes and knolls in 85% of the cases, and are only very rarely found on flat land or in hollows. This is perhaps due to an interest in keeping the dead in sight and therefore in mind. However, it appears that attempts to monumentalise these sites were rarely undertaken. Indeed, sloping land does not necessarily provide maximum vantage. Together with the provision of a ceramic vessel, probably containing some form of sustenance, it may be that this landscape setting related to concerns with the preservation of the body and therefore beliefs in maintaining the body as a coherent entity for the afterlife, the next world. If so, then the Beaker burial practice marks one of the first widespread expressions of just such concerns and beliefs in Britain. Turning now to the Beakers themselves. In their conventionalised and published form, Beaker pots are of course shown as two-dimensional black and white artefacts with cross-sections through them. But a surface treatment of white paste was applied to the decoration in a considerable number of these vessels. The appearance of this white paste against a highly burnished fabric would have been quite striking, I think, at the time and continues to be today. Of the 54 beakers examined under the stereo microscope, 57% had clear evidence of this white paste, while additional 22% were probable or possible examples of this, making this far more common in beakers than was previously considered. Scanning electron microscopes analysis indicated the presence of calcium and phosphorus, while further analysis of 4 beakers using Raman spectroscopy has indicated that this was in the form of calcium hydroxyapatite, the major inorganic constituent of bone. The paste therefore appears to have comprised of a ground down cremated bone substance applied along with an as yet unidentified fixing agent. Sampling and analysis is, however, continuing, including ensuring that none of the material analysed is the result of natural or taphonomic processes or of old conservation work, but it's hoped that that's not the case. While it's not currently possible to determine whether the bone was from a human or an animal source, if it is indeed bone, the presence in the funerary context appears to indicate a symbolic as well as an aesthetic significance. Pots are understood in terms of or as symbolic bodies, and among a number of cultures, our own terminology for pots, of course, is littered with references to bodies. Many interpretations are possible, therefore. The beaker may comment on the identity and fate of the body that they accompanied in the ground, or serve as representations of some sort of ancestral forebearer of the beaker tradition. We may also consider pottery in terms of colour and potential overlaps with dress and funerary events as being memorable and vivid occasions. This example, spotted on a trip that I took last summer, is a pot placed in the corner of a room in rural Sri Lanka in order to bring fortune and protection to its residents. It perhaps illustrates the point to some extent. It's colourful in its own right, and it's sealed using a colourful fabric to protect a special recipe of spices and the first rice of the harvest. Beaker pots, then, were not rows of black and white cross-sections in handy or quite chunky academic volumes, but were more vibrant and meaningful in the round when seen and held. In terms of beaker contents, this is an area that's long needed attention. It's been suggested that beakers contained alcoholic beverages for some considerable decades now, for instance as part of a cult package. However, doctorate research by Lucia Sorbel at the University of Bristol has shown that among a sample of 82 funerary beakers, around half used to contain dairy fats, for instance milk or curd. A possible exception to this teetotalism is the recent shortkiss find from Udney Green in Aberdeenshire, where the traces of beeswax may relate to a honey flavouring or even the trace of mead. That kiss also produced pollen data that Richard Tipping has argued represented an open, almost treeless agrarian landscape. The surrounding land was grazed and barley grew locally. It was therefore placed intentionally in the heart of everyday farming life. And it's these small insights about content and setting that are so valuable, showing the way in which funerary practices were entangled with the rigour, but also the potential calamity of everyday farming lifestyles, of nurturing and provision. In terms of grave goods and assemblages, some 46% of beaker burials in North East Scotland are recorded as containing only a beaker vessel, with no other grave goods. However, we have to view this figure with great suspicion. There are clear biases of recovery and recording. The discovery of additional artefacts has risen sharply as excavation recording standards have improved. Indeed, before the 1970s, some 65% of beaker burials were recorded with a pot only. 20% were associated with one grave good type, while only 15% were associated with two or more grave good types. By comparison, in the modern era, post-1970 or post-Ian Shepherd, only 11% were recorded with pots only. 32% were with one or more grave good types, and a substantial 58% were with two or more grave good types. However, having said that, it's still apparent that beaker burials are not always or normally lavish. The iconic associations, the wrist guards, the bone belt rings, the barbed and tanged arrowheads, are relatively scarce. More common is the addition of a second or third beaker, of flint tools, of organic materials such as charcoal, and even unworked pebbles of quartz or other attractive materials which may have served as amulets for the dead. Of beaker burials with a single additional grave good type, it's notable that almost 50% are with flint tools. Among assemblages of two or more, these grave good types, stone tools again feature so highly, although all the iconic grave good types, wrist guards and bone belt rings, belong to this category as well. And although I say they're rare, they are worth dwelling on because they are so remarkable. And one of the things that makes them so remarkable in my mind is the fact that they are so uniform in lots of ways. For instance, the Culduffel and the Driffield burials both feature little pieces of amber along with the wrist guard. And it's the distance involved in the similarity which I think really makes them stand out and has always made people want to talk about these instead of the flints that are so much more common. Of these archery graves then, a Bayesian statistical model of around 6 or 7 available dates places them amongst the earliest of the beaker tradition, representing a relatively coherent phenomenon with connections to several other regions, as I've mentioned. Several of the archer's stone wrist guards are made from Cumbrian Great Langdale tuff type rock, seemingly the same source of rock used for the famous polished Neolithic axe heads. The 3 available dates for these Langdale type wrist guards are again statistically consistent, suggesting that they may have been included in funerary practices relatively early on in the sequence and over a short period of time, which may suggest they derive from particular workshops or perhaps even particular craftsmen. It seems then that the early adoption of new practices and beliefs were associated with these items of ritual paraphernalia or costume. Perhaps they helped to reassure communities who were making their first contacts with the rituals and metalworking know-how of Beaker people by evoking links with long-standing and trusted exchange networks of the Langdale material and auspicious materials from a familiar stone world. In addition, 3 unusual hourglass perforated stone discs have been discovered in the northeast, all featuring radial decoration. The date of the Park Quarry 1 Cist suggests, and the typology of the pots that they were associated with, suggests that these were deposited substantially or later at least than the Archery burials of the Chalcolithic, and represent a more localised early Bronze Age fashion among the Beaker communities of the northeast. Nonetheless, despite this sort of subtle shift towards a more localised form and type of grave good, Ian Shepherd and Stuart Needham are surely right to note that the Park Quarry disc bears interest in comparison with the Irish gold discs, sometimes called sun discs, which may have been part of funerary dress. And perhaps these evocations of the sun relate to the worship of the heavenly bodies, of the sun in particular, as suggested by the alignment of almost all Beaker short kists, either east-west or north-east-south-west, to the setting and rising sun. And I apologise for the roughness of the illustration of Park Quarry Kist 1, but hopefully in this example it shows you just how similar it is to that Irish gold disc from County Cork. Even if gold work is rarely found or not found at all in Beaker kists, the motifs from Irish gold work are also found on some Beaker pots, including this interesting vessel from Pitdriki, which is also like Park Quarry Kist 1 in the south of Aberdeenshire towards the Mearns and Deeside. And it tells us about connections, I think, between Ireland and Scotland during the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age. Ireland at this time was the major source of copper, and these connections may have been motivated then by metalworking know-how that was brought with the Beaker phenomenon from continental Europe, Ireland providing the material and the Beaker network really providing the skills and the knowledge. In terms of the split in artefact packages, I've mentioned a lot that are associated with men, but not so much the female grave goods. What's notable is that the most complex female assemblages contain 2 or maybe 3 beakers, as well as a second individual, for instance a child at Nethercriggy and Keerbell-Helvey. And they also are associated with assemblages of flint tools, often in larger numbers. For instance at Menara and Paradise Road, these are quite big assemblages of flint tools, which might be telling us something about the emphasis of funerary practices. But I would say that all these things perhaps relate back to notions of nurturing and provision, whether it be male or female, just in different ways. And this gives hopefully a sense of the additive choices which were available to those undertaking Beaker burial, showing the connections between certain artefacts and the choices, how they were built up over time. So, to move on to this gender dichotomy, or the relevance of gender in Beaker burial, a dichotomy between the body postures of male and female graves has been noted for some time, including amongst the earlier corded wear traditions of Europe and then into Beaker burials later on. Lecky Shepherd was the first, and also interestingly the most recent, to undertake systematic studies of the evidence from Britain, both in eastern Scotland and in Yorkshire. And she highlighted the striking contrast between males and females, with females on the right-hand side and men on the left, males with their heads to the northeast or east, and women with their heads to the west or southwest, both being unified by the fact that they both faced south. And this is a remarkably strong pattern, the type of pattern that prehistorians love to see. And this is an illustration of Lecky's most recent work, which again draws attention to the clear gender split. But Lecky's, interestingly, also made a connection with the artefacts that were found in these burials, with the beakers themselves. For instance, the pairing of Borrowstone Cist 1 and 2 beakers, with the male pot being found with an elderly man and the female with a sub-adult and the smaller pot there. The size and form of the vessels is different despite the similarities in decoration and of fabric. Intriguingly, Lecky argues that this reflects the differences in Asian sex that were coming through not just from body posture, but into the grave goods themselves. And cross-culturally, we find this kind of what we might call an ideal duality in many other times and places. In terms of gender, we find the unity of men and women presented as an elemental or ideal social unit in many cultures and religions, not least through the story and art of Adam and Eve, but also more broadly the notion of a duality between two forces paired together, and the quintessential desire and search for a fulfilling complementary other reoccurs repeatedly in our religious and philosophical concepts and myths. For instance, in that of Castor and Pollux, of Romulus and Remus, of yin and yang. And it's perhaps possible to find, in fact it is possible to find many examples of ideal duality expressed in material culture of areas such as Africa. For instance, the primordial couple is a fine statue belonging to the Dogon people of Mali, and was probably displayed at important funerals. The male and female are reflections of one another with subtle differences. For instance, with respect to the grave goods and associations of beaker burials, the male, as seen in this detailed shot, carries a quiver, while the female carries a small child, reminiscent of even the differences we've seen today in beaker burial grave good categories, and both perhaps relating to the ways of nurturing provision and how these interlocked. At least that is the case for the Dogon example. While the primordial couple references gender roles, it also transcends them. The Dogon people conceive of every soul as a twin male and female spirit of paired opposites. The association of a child, an adult male with a beaker and a horn spoon at Broomend of Cricky, and by the adult male with archery equipment and a child at Uppermill and Cruden, may refer to this kind of unity beyond the gender dichotomy, of things breaking down, of it not always being about men and women, but about the notion that the two are contained with one individual as well. Furthermore, among the Viso people of Madagascar, northeast orientation is a sacred orientation due to its association with the axis of the rising and setting sun, with auspicious events and indeed with the ancestors. At their burial sites, wooden rectangular boxes contain male and female sculptures positioned at opposite corners of the box in dancing poses. The gender of the deceased is given prominence in the northeast corner, where it faces its opposite partner in the southwest. And this, to me, is very reminiscent of the kind of patterns that we see with male and female burials in Beaker, Aberdeenshire. The curator, Alison Lagama, notes that the posture of the figures powerfully retains the suggestion that they are somehow responding to each other's movements, making their connection eternally vital. And just to continue on that theme of something being eternally vital, it seems a productive way to consider beaker burials. Their compliance to a pattern of two halves, united by a southerly direction, in that they were prevented from being considered in isolation or as reducible to named individuals. They were instead part of something bigger. They were an echoing image, with each taking on meaning insofar as it was not the other, it was not the unseen other. Thus, each new burial would evoke previous burials, partners, generations, and indeed the cosmological principle of an ideal duality itself. However, the gender imbalance seen in the funerary record, if we cast our minds back, between males and females, with many more men than women, may have been masked by an ideology of equality in this case. Alternatively, it may have been explicitly promoted by associating males with the east and northeast, with the rising sun and rebirth. In this context, the apparent rise in female burials and the breakdown of this gender dichotomy pattern in grave posture with the subsequent food vessel tradition is of extreme significance and interest, suggesting changes in the way society was organised and structured. To move on to the typology of beakers, one of the key aims of the project was to develop an updated typology or typochronology. The large number of high quality radiocarbon dates obviously aided this aim. Traditional approaches have produced typologies which primarily consider the form and decoration of prehistoric pottery and relate these similarities and differences to chronology and rather static, bounded cultural blocks, the beaker block, the food vessel block. This approach decontextualises the pots and can fail to recognise the full range of factors that actually influence their form and decoration. This does not mean, however, that the typological approach can be rejected outright, as many modern archaeologists of recent years have done. In their rigorous observations, past and previous typologies have no doubt identified similarities and differences which can now be related to other factors such as age and sex of individuals, just as Lucky Shepherd has done in the case of Borrowstone 1 and 2 and elsewhere. In other words, funerary beakers did not exist in isolation, and their typology has to be understood as part of the overall symbolism and significance of beaker burial. And that's what we try to do with this scheme. Firstly, however, on an empirical note, we may note that these can be the four types that I want to profile today of the around 6 or 7 that we've come up with. The four types that we can loosely define have ratios and proportions of height and rim diameter and neck depth that we can put our finger on and talk about. However, I would argue that they only really come to life and only become interesting when we consider the wider attributes of these types. For instance, the tall, short-necked beakers have a slender profile with a neck depth that is never much more than a third of their overall height. In terms of chronological range, the 12 dates suggest that this form of funerary beaker was in use relatively early in the sequence, in the Scottish sequence, from at least the middle of the 24th century until the start of the 22nd. In other words, the Chalcolithic. In terms of age and sex structure, they are with adult males in 11 out of 11 cases in North East Scotland and 14 out of 19 cases in the whole of Eastern Scotland. Where data is available for age, a considerable number, around 70%, are over 25 years. In other words, they're the middle adults, the mature individuals, the elderly of this society, with 20% over 35 years, and that's really as old as we can take these individuals. In terms of spatial patterning, where data is available, 12 from 15, or out of 15, are on the left-hand side, and a further 75%, 11 out of 15, are aligned east-west. These factors are, of course, part of wider spatial rules. Thus, 9 out of 13 are on the left-hand side with their heads to the east and northeast. Furthermore, 13 from 17 have beakers at the head end of the burial, including 8 from 13 with beakers precisely behind the back of the skull. So all these spatial patterns are starting to tell us about how the grave itself was built up through practices and rituals that were undertaken. In terms of associations with these types of pots, these are with elements of Stuart Needham's primary package, principally the stone wrist guards of Great Langdale type, for instance, as well as the bone belt rings that we've already seen are associated with typed radiocarbon dates. It's worth noting that there's a relatively close connection between this type of burial, this type of type, beaker type, and other areas of Britain, including Yorkshire and even Wiltshire. And this is really, I think, evidence that the North East at this time, in the early formation of the beaker tradition, belonged and interacted with the wider beaker network. At the same time, the same chronology of the tall, short-necked, we have these basic, what are called basic S-profile vessels. And these have a number of decorative features that are the same, for instance, the crisscross motif, but in general they're relatively plainly decorated compared to the tall, short-necked vessels. The argument for contemporaneity with tall short-necked is supported by the age structure of these individuals. In 5 from the 6 available examples, these are young adults. They're not like tall short-necked with their mature and elderly individuals, and they therefore contrast with that type. And given their chronological similarity and the fact that at Borrowstone Cist Cemetery we have the 2 types of pot next to one another in very similarly dated graves, it's possible to suggest that perhaps these relate to some kind of initiation level, some sort of status within Beaker ritual that these individuals had not yet attained. Once you go through that basic S profile stage, once you get to a mature age, you are given a tall short neck vessel, but not until that point. There is no more elaborate grave goods with this type than flint tools. In 6 from 7 cases, these are flint knives, either secondary or small plano-convex knives. And indeed, the burials for Mudley Green and Sandhole, Fetterangus, have many features in common, as can be seen in this slide, not just pot, but also the associations and reading carbon dates and age. So moving swiftly on, the elongated and cut neck beakers have a much more exaggerated neck than the other types. And the 7 available dates suggest that they had a range that was later than tall short-necked and basic S profile. In other words, they started around the 22nd century and continued onward from then. They therefore overlap only with the very end of the types we've already seen. And this appears to herald changes in beaker burial in North East Scotland, possibly connected to other changes at this time. For instance, the introduction of that early Bronze Age, early bronze working powerhouse in Buchan in Aberdeenshire, which drew on Irish copper. It's even possible to suggest that the form of Irish food vessels, these necklace bowls, perhaps had an influence on beakers. For instance, perhaps exaggerating the neck was a way of distancing oneself from these necklace food vessels that were coming in to the North East Scotland through the Great Glen. In other words, perhaps the exaggeration of the neck was some kind of reaction to an ethnic other, to something or someone that was different and did things differently. Whereas the tall short neck vessels are almost invariably east-west aligned, this type of pot is likely to be found with north-east, south-west aligned graves, or just as likely to be found with north-east, south-west aligned graves as east-west aligned graves. And it's also notable that there is considerable variation in the position of the beaker in relation to the body and the grave. So again, these structuring principles and rules can be seen to be migrating and changing through time with different types of pot. In terms of age structure, there's a notable distribution across all principal age groups. Over 50% are younger than 25 years, and i.e. they're not fully adult. And that contrasts with the concentration of over 25-year-olds that was evident for tall, short-necked vessels. In terms of sex structure, while adult females still make up only 1/3 of the overall group, this is 2 or 3 times more than the number of females found with the tall, short-necked vessels at this later date. A number of early of these cut-necked vessels are included with more than one individual, but never more than 2 individuals. And this can be seen at Nethercriggy and Kearbell-Helvey, and it can also be seen at Dryburn Quarry and Little Pinkerton, both of which are in East Lothian, and both have second individuals. And the dates for these graves state clearly to after the 22nd century BC, which is nice. One of the final groups that I want to talk about is these globular or very short-necked vessels. The available dates for these suggest they started slightly earlier than the elongated cut-necked, but continued to around about the same time. The decoration of this type is quite important. The vessels regularly feature a distinctive motif of filled, opposed isosceles triangles on either side of a central band, and sometimes with criss-cross fringing in between. The decoration on the inside of the neck of this example from Fraserburgh here is also significant because it can be described as false relief, a technique that's most usually found in Irish food vessel bowls and vases. Indeed, this unpublished Irish food vessel bowl, also from Fraserburgh, on the far end of the frame, demonstrates false relief decoration and indicates that there were Irish connections with the Beaker communities of the Buchan region of Aberdeenshire. And perhaps this was again related to the supply and use of copper in this particular region during the early Bronze Age from the 22nd century. And again, parallels for this type of motif can be found on Irish vases as well. In terms of spatial distribution, perhaps the most important point is to go back and look at where these beakers cluster. The red dots are the distribution of this classic motif of opposed isosceles triangles. And they all seem to be concentrated around the Buchan region. And again, this perhaps suggests connections and involvements with that beaker, of that bronze working area of Buchan during the Migdal-Marnock tradition after the 22nd century BC. And this is also the area where we get those Irish connections. As a speculative aside, we might consider, given their chronology and the distribution, whether this type of almost flame-like motif of these vessels might relate to or cite that industry or that tradition of metalworking in this particular region of Aberdeenshire. Moving on to the final group. These are also the latest of the beakers to look at. They belong to the final century of the 3rd millennium and the first millennium of the first century of the 2nd millennium BC. In terms of form, they lack a clear distinction between the neck and the body, and instead of this usual comb which we find on so many beakers, these start now to use things like incision and impression instead on the surface of the pots. And this represents a really significant change in not just decoration, but also in the techniques that are being used to construct beaker pots. These pots are also associated with no longer just with inhumations, but now with some cremation burials. And indeed, this is the period when cremation is starting to come into the funerary practices of Britain. In terms of associations, it's very interesting to note that there are some really quite lavish grave good associations. They're directly associated with bronze daggers and jet ornaments, and indirectly with food vessel and cinerary urns on a number of occasions. They therefore belong to a horizon when there was a much greater choice, in grave good traditions that were available for the inclusion in graves. Most of these beakers are from out with the northeast of Scotland and belong to areas such as East Central Scotland. And this is notable because those areas never really took to beaker burial in the same way as Aberdeenshire did. There's other key differences between earlier and late types of pot. For instance, they often were found in complex cemetery mounds that were covered by monuments or dug into older monuments. And that occurs in around 66% of cases. This can be compared to the other types of pot that we've seen tonight, of which only around 5% of cases are associated with monuments. Indeed, these late beakers are more have associated with monuments that's more akin to the dagger graves and the food vessel graves of after the 22nd century BC. So late beakers then, I'd like to suggest, represent a major shift in beaker burial practices. They were modified to fit with newly emerging funerary practices that had increasingly little to do with that beaker network that we started off with. They may instead have been somewhat subsumed within indigenous funerary practices and much older Neolithic traditions of monument construction. Indeed, the 4 late beakers that we do have from the northeast of Scotland, several are cut, around 3 I think, are cut into earlier Neolithic monuments. And this is also suggested by the breakdown in that body posture pattern that we saw earlier on. And we can really summarise all these findings in 3 main phases. We have that first phase with the tall, short-necked and basic S profile pots, when there's apparent age and sex distinctions, perhaps related to initiation or status. In the second phase, we have the elongated and cut-necked as well as the globular vessels. So in one case, we're getting an exaggeration of the neck. In the other cases, we're getting things with very small necks that have stronger connections to Ireland. And one wonders if there's perhaps developing a tension within the northeast regarding connections with Ireland, with one group, i.e. the group involved with metalworking and sourcing of copper, having far more in common or interested involvement with the Irish sources than the areas around the Buchan region, who are perhaps responding to that neckless food vessel by exaggerating and emphasising the necks on their vessels. And finally, that third phase, when we see a switch to more indigenous concerns and influences. So, moving on to the final section tonight. This is about beakers and monuments. I want to consider how beakers related to ceremonial monuments, because I think the relationship reveals some intriguing patterns. In around 5 or 6 of the excavated recumbent stone circles that have been excavated in the northeast, 5 or 6 have produced beaker pottery. I'd like to suggest that some of the principles found among beaker burials are also seen in the architecture of recumbent stone circles. We see a connection, for instance, in the architecture of the spatial patterning of Foreglen House in Buchan, where quartz-like pebbles and 3 beakers were laid out in adherence to the typical arrangement, or a common arrangement, of recumbent stone circles, with a rectangular pavement in the location usually preserved for the southwestern setting of the large recumbent and its flankers, and a line of quartz tracing that northeast-southwest alignment that forms such a major structuring principle at these stone circles. Furthermore, recumbent stone circles, by virtue of their recumbent, have 2 sides, often described as the eastern and western side. Indeed, it's often commented that the flanking stones on either side of the recumbent are markedly different in size or shape to one another, a feature that was certainly within the control of communities who constructed these monuments. That's certainly the case if we judge by their skill in, for instance, grading the stones within the circle. And it's possible that the 2 flankers then represent different halves of the circle, different principles and ideas, much akin to the east-west, left-hand, right-hand divide of beaker burial. If so, then just as the southerly direction of beaker burial practices unites the 2, male and female, so does the recumbent in its southerly arc unite the 2 sides of the circle, the 2 flanking stones, and thus represent a resolution of sorts, a sacred bond between the east and the west, sunrise and sunset, perhaps even male and female if one wants to look at it that way. So then it would represent not only a closed door, as Richard Bradley has argued for the recumbent, but also a bridge of sorts. Recalling the presence of white inlay on many beaker vessels, we might seek an additional connection in terms of the colour of beakers and recumbent stone circles. The observation of the Milky Moon and acts involving fire and the deposition of quartz have long been recognised as characteristics of these monuments. Quartz, of course, white quartz is also, of course, known from beaker burials, featuring within several of the graves at Borrowstone. Unfortunately, the chronology of recumbent stone circles remains relatively fluid, with possible dates covering the later Neolithic and early Bronze Age. It therefore remains to be established whether the cosmological principles that they may have shared were the result of a unified worldview, or whether there was some sort of pre-existing Neolithic principle that developed these monuments and may help to explain why people in Aberdeenshire found the beaker phenomenon so interesting and adopted it so quickly, some sort of pre-existing disposition towards structured spatial arrangements. If the former, if indeed that was the case, perhaps recumbent stone circles helped to explain why the vast majority of beaker burials in Aberdeenshire are not associated with monuments. Funerary and ceremonial activities may have been split between the 2 contexts, with recumbent stone circles acting as the communal counterpoint to the more individualistic character of beaker burial practices. there are, to put things in a wider context, clear differences in the funerary traditions in different regions of eastern Scotland. In regions such as East Central Scotland, there was a relatively wide variety of grave goods or burial traditions available. These included jet and food vessel graves as well as dagger graves, but only after the 22nd century. Many of the graves were monumentalised. Some of the kists within these cemeteries were arranged in symmetrical patterns that are comparable to the Irish funerary traditions. Some were within much older late Neolithic henge monuments. So burial practices were not adopted in significant numbers until the start of the early Bronze Age proper, and were regionally specific when they did appear. It's perhaps no coincidence that these were areas well located for contacts with Western Scotland and from there to Ireland. For instance, the East Central Scotland is one area we get this type of funerary practice of Irish type food vessels and jet, but we also get it at the end of the Great Glen. These are the two areas that are so well positioned for contacts with the West Coast and then on to Ireland. Furthermore, it's tempting to suggest that the continued relevance of henge monuments and ceremonial complexes with their roots in the Neolithic reflects a different set of beliefs, of pre-existing beliefs, and a different type of social organisation, one which may have prevented the widespread adoption of Beaker burial in this region during the first phase of Beaker practice, during those tall, short-necked and basic S-profile vessels. In the northeast, meanwhile, the regional prominence of Beakers was matched by the rare occurrence of traditions common elsewhere in eastern Scotland. For example, in Aberdeenshire there are very few food vessel graves. In a further contrast, the vast majority of Beaker burials were flat graves. They weren't monumentalised, as we've heard. As we've also heard, this region is notable for the coincidence of distinctive traditions of material culture and spatial arrangement, such as recumbent stone circles and of bronze metalworking, while carved stone balls are a distinctive regional feature of this region probably during the later Neolithic. Thus, the Beaker traditions can be characterised by being highly formalised and relatively normative. This regularity may have built itself on existing traditions that emphasise normative reproduction, such as the formal orientation of architecture in those recumbent stone circles. It may also be detected in the formality of bronze metalworking from the 22nd century, which included, of course, the careful control of materials, temperature and timing to make relatively uniform objects, such as the distinctive flat migdale axes of the region. The combination of tin and copper into bronze is perhaps itself an ideal duality of sorts, a pairing of materials to make a stronger alloy. So we can perhaps describe Beaker burials, recumbent stone circles and the bronze metalworking tradition as products of a worldview connected with formality and what I've called ideal duality. Thus it can be argued that regional differences occurred in different geographical settings which had different historical events, such as the development of early Bronze Age knowledge in North East Scotland. And these are the sort of backgrounds against which we have to consider the development of early Bronze Age traditions. They didn't occur in a vacuum. There was pre-existing histories, pre-existing structuring principles which people and communities held, into which the funerary practice had to fit, if you like. But we should also remember the role of, yes, indeed, pre-existing belief systems. As I've mentioned, I won't repeat myself. So to conclude, going back to the questions posed at the start of the talk, to what extent do Beaker burials reflect status and individualism in the modern sense? Individuals were indeed singled out as special. There were more males than females, for instance, but they were not clear. They were not unencumbered individuals. Rather, they were buried in ways which, if you like, subsumed individuals into concepts and categories of age and sex, based and maybe even stages of initiation within that tradition. The dead were also placed in the lived landscape, sustained by its produce in the form of the contents of the pot, orientated to the sunrise and the sunset. Individuals were buried with rituals that gave the events familiar, prescribed orders. And I would perhaps suggest that this was an ideal order to which mourners involved in everyday life, in personal relationships between men and women, and those concerned with daily farming tasks, could aspire when looking at the grave, when considering it, but which they could never be entirely assured in their own daily lives. Only in death could it be truly fixed in place. If, as prehistorians, we continue to find the relatively strong patterns of Beaker burials so interesting and fascinating, perhaps it's because they tap into some of the basic concerns that we have. In their ordered optimism, perhaps we find it a kind of solace of sorts. Finally, we can review some of the points that we've discussed tonight in the form of some chronological maps based on the radiocarbon dates that have been available, and ordering these in terms of 100-year slices. We have to obviously offer the warning that these are only dated burials, but given the great work which so many different projects and so much work that Alison Sheridan's done in obtaining the grave, obtaining dates for burials, these provide quite a nice series of maps now, just dealing with dated individuals. In the first instance, we see the earliest and Chalcolithic single burials. These are the tall and short-necked and the basic S-profile vessels. While in the second case, we see these elongated and cup-necked and globular vessels coming into the fore. Skipping the third and moving into the 22nd century, we see East Central Scotland coming into the picture only now, really. And during this period, we see a greater variety of funerary practices. It's now that we see the daggers and the jet and the food vessel graves. But what was after the Beaker period? Well, what we can see from this distribution map is that Aberdeenshire, after the Beaker period, avoided the food vessel and jet and dagger burials. In other words, it avoided the other types of single graves which other areas adopted. They were more conservative than that. When they do reappear, when funerary practices do reappear in Aberdeenshire, they seem to be associated with collared urns and cordoned urns and food vessel urns and cremation. In other words, they've gained a kind of distance from the single burial that they practiced with inhumation in Beaker pots. And what's notable is a number of these cremation burials are found at much older monuments. For instance, at Broome End of Crickey, excavated more recently, re-excavated by Richard Bradley, but also adjacent to Lone End of Davie at the Recumbent Stone Circle there. In other words, they appear to look for the security of the past. And yes, indeed, as a final point and a concluding thought, a central theme of the Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age funerary evidence of North East and indeed Eastern Scotland is of changes and of new ideas coming in and new people coming in. But these existed in a productive tension with the long-lasting and deep-rooted traditions that already existed in this area, in these areas. And this is really the context, I think, that we need to set the Europe-wide Beaker phenomenon if we're really to understand how particular communities engaged with it and made it into something of their own. Thank you very much.